Please be seated. Number 119 is a song invitation. Number 119.
We are studying some lessons from the book of Proverbs, and I would encourage you, if you have your Bible or if you have access to one there close, that you might just take the book of Proverbs and open up to chapter 1 as we study tonight. There is no doubt but that in the first 9 chapters of this book, Solomon is emphasizing the fact that wisdom and understanding and knowledge all come from God, and that it is to God and in looking to Him that we get those things that are needful for us in life. That if we would have understanding and knowledge, if we would have those things that are needful and necessary for us in life day by day, we must look to God. We must hear from Him. We must seek His will and His instruction. And so we look to God. We look to see what He would have us to do and how He would have us to live. And He's the one that we answer to. And so when you look at the book of Proverbs and you especially read these first 9 chapters, you have to be noticing of that. And the fact that he says that wisdom and understanding and knowledge all come from God. Do not forget that. Do not forget the source of those things. But then he says, you see, if you start in chapter 1, and in chapter 1, if you start with saying in verse 5 where he says, a wise man will hear and will increase learning, and a man of understanding shall attain unto wise counsel. To understand a proverb and the interpretation of the words of the wise, their dark sayings. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Here he is, and he says, you've got to hear God. You've got to listen to God. But the very next thing he says is what I want to focus on tonight. Because after he says you must listen to God, you must look to God, you must seek your instruction from God, the very next thing he says is, my son, hear the instruction of thy father. Forsake not the law of thy mother, for they shall be an ornament of grace unto thy head and chains about thy neck. After he emphasizes, and after he begins by saying you must submit to God, you must listen to God, the very next thing he says is, you've got to be respectful of mother and father. You've got to realize that real true knowledge and understanding come from the counsel you receive from them. And so you listen to what mothers and fathers have taught you, and you learn those lessons. Now, truly, you have to compare what God has said and be sure that what you're being taught by mothers and fathers are indeed in harmony with what God has said. And what God has said truly outweighs anything that moms and dads will say. But understand that God says that there is a work that's being done here by God that is enhanced by mothers and fathers. So my question tonight is, why? Why should children listen to their mothers and fathers? What is it about mothers and fathers that are such that they ought to be listened to? That they ought to be, that one would take any care or concern or listen to them? Get over to chapter 4, and in verse 1 he says, hear ye children the instruction of a father, and attend to no knowledge. You turn over another page and you get over to chapter 6, and in chapter 6 you come down to verse 20. In verse 20 it says, my son, keep thy father's commandment and forsake not the law of thy mother. And all through this book you keep hearing him say, as he's talking about listening to God, you hear him say, Listen to mothers and fathers. Hear the instruction of mothers and fathers. And my question is not, does God say that? Because plainly He does. My question is, why does He say that? Why does He say listen to mothers and fathers? Why, when you get over to chapter 23, does He say in verse 22, hearken unto thy father that begat thee, and despise not thy mother when she is old? Why does He say that about mothers and fathers? Why is it that you ought to give attendance to them? Why should you give an ear to them? Why would you listen to mothers and fathers? And I'm going to give you some reasons tonight why you ought to listen to moms and dads. First, let me just remind you that you won't always have moms and dads to seek counsel from. So learn what you can and learn the lessons you can from them while you have the opportunity. Because their wisdom and knowledge is greater than yours, and they can help you if you'll listen. Not everyone will. But the first reason I would give you tonight why you ought to listen to mothers and fathers is because they have more knowledge than you do. You don't like to hear this. Some children, some young people don't like to hear it. But I'm going to tell you, your mothers and fathers, your grandmothers and grandfathers are smarter than you are. Compared to your parents, you are ignorant. Now you may say, well, I can do geometry. And my mom and dad can't help me with that at all. They don't know a thing about geometry. I'm going to tell you, if you don't learn the lesson, first of all, that they're smarter than you and they have greater knowledge than you and they know more than you do, you are missing out on a great resource. Mothers and fathers are given the responsibility of rearing children because they have a greater knowledge than the children. Your parents know better than anyone else. They know you better than anyone else. When parents are giving instruction to their children, they ought to be able to give them wise instruction, because if anybody knows my child, it ought to be me. If anybody knows all the quirks, if anybody knows the ways of getting across to them, if anyone knows anything about my children and how to deal with my children and how to help my children, it ought to be me. Now listen, I may not know how to talk to your child. I may not know how to instruct your child. I may not know how to lead your child because I don't know your child like you do. I can do the best I can do, but what I can basically do is I can tell you, here's what the Lord says. Here's what the will of God is. And I can try to get you to see God and to understand what God's will is in your life. But nobody knows you better than your mother and father. And I will tell you that one of the reasons you ought to listen to them is because they know you better than you do. And they always will. They've raised you. Or I guess in proper English you'd say they have reared you. They brought you into the world. They've known you from the day you came into the world and from the very moment you breathed your first breath. They've been there. They know you better than you know yourselves. And parents, I would remind you that you have the potential to be the greatest teachers your children will ever know. Because you know them better than anyone. If you have more than one child, I'll tell you something else you know better than anybody else. And that is that your children are different. You can raise them in the same house. You can raise them with the same mother and father. You can have the same principles that are being taught to them, but I'm going to tell you, your children are different. And the way you teach them, the way you talk to them, the way you help to rear them is going to be different, because what will work with one will not necessarily work with the next. Because children are different. And nobody knows you, the child, nobody knows a child better than the parent, but they also know the differences in you. They see them. And you're not alike. You may have a brother or a sister that has the same color eyes, the same color hair. They may walk the same, they may talk the same, they may be the same in so many ways, but they are not the same. And you might as well understand that you're not going to be able to teach them in the same way, to instruct them in the same way, because they are different. But nobody knows your difference is better than your mothers and fathers. Nobody. I've got 2 sisters, and my mother and daddy would tell you plainly that there's a difference in the 3 of us. I have 3 daughters. I can tell you, my 3 daughters are different. I've got 5 grandchildren. I can tell you, my 5 grandchildren are different. Now, I don't think anybody ought to know any one of those any better than the parent should. And the reason that children ought to listen to the parents is because the reason they ought to receive instruction from parents is because nobody knows that child better than the parent. Some people think they do, but they don't. And unlike their school teachers, and unlike their counselors, and unlike everybody else who see them for a few minutes a day on a school day, nobody sees them and knows more about them and is better acquainted with them and knows everything about them better than parents. And so the first reason I would tell you that children ought to listen to their parents is because they are your parents and they know you better than anybody, whether you believe it or not. I'm going to tell you a second reason you ought to listen to them. They've got more experience than you do. They've been there, done that. They have likely already made those mistakes they're trying to keep you from making. You see, it's hard for children to recognize this, but your parents, one time in their lives, were your age. They were little people just like you are. And that's hard for our children to understand that we ever were. They think that somehow we just came out this way. And they sometimes don't realize that we've been there, that we've gone through these things, that we've dealt with these things. And someone will say, well, nobody knows what all we have to deal with in this day and time. And things are so much different today than what they've ever been. Well, I'll tell you that there may be a lot of things that are different than what we dealt with, but every one of us who sit here, we had temptations we dealt with. It may not be the same temptations. It may not be the drugs that now you see so prevalent, but I can tell you, we had things that we dealt with. We had tobacco. We had alcohol. We had those things that were a temptation to us, just like those temptations are to our children. And we know what it's like to have to deal with those temptations. We've experienced that. We've experienced temptation. We experienced that as we were going through life. We were made to know and to understand that those things existed, that they were there. And by our experiences, we learn things. We learn from those experiences how to handle those things, how to deal with those things. We have experiences in life that our children have not yet had. So one of the reasons that children ought to listen to their parents is because of the experience they have. Friend, they're older. They've been there. They've gone through these things. They've dealt with these things. And as long as they live, they're going to be older and have experiences you haven't experienced yet. And so as long as they live, you're going to learn things from them. My dad was 91 years old and I was still learning. He was still teaching me things. When he was 91 years old, I could still ask him how to do certain things, and he could tell me because he had experience. He'd been there. One of the things that ought to cause children to listen to their parents is because they're experienced. You may not realize it, but your parents have been there. They've gone through these things. They've lived through this. And because of the experiences they have had, you ought to seek their advice. A child is wise who turns to his mother or father for instruction because of the experiences mother and father have had. I'm going to tell you a third reason you ought to listen to moms and dads. It's because they're wiser than you are. I'm going to tell you that as children, we sometimes as children do dumb things. We sometimes act foolishly. And the only way to curb that, or the only way to get around that, is to listen to someone who's wiser. And our parents have wisdom. They don't always show it, but they should have the wisdom that comes from experience, from having been there, from having gone through those things. And we should have learned those lessons. Really, last time when we were talking about Solomon, do you remember why we said Solomon was who Solomon was and why it is that he's asking for wisdom? It's because of the fact that he had a father who taught him. Hear ye, children, the instruction of a father, and attend to no understanding, for I give you good doctrine. Forsake ye not my law. He says, for I was my father's son, tender, and only beloved in his sight, in the sight of my mother. He taught me also and said unto me, let thine heart retain my words, keep my commandments, and live. Brethren, you ought to listen to your moms and dads, your parents, because of the wisdom they have, the wisdom that they have accumulated through the years, the wisdom that they have accumulated through experiences. Because they have the experience, because they have the knowledge, and because they have the experiences, and because they've gone through those things, they have the wisdom to know how to deal with those things. And when you don't listen, you grow up to be a fool. And that's not me. That's what Solomon's warning against in the book of Proverbs. He doesn't want these children to grow up to be foolish. And so he's telling them to learn from the wisdom of the parents, to learn from them. Now, the wisdom of parents comes from the wisdom of God. And so we as parents, we've got to glean from God's wisdom. We've got to look to see what God has said and study His Word and know what His will is and to be wise in Him so that we can be wise in rearing our children. So that we can do what we need to do and be the kinds of parents that we ought to be. Children of Christian parents are the greatest blessed of all people. If you grow up, or if you grew up with a mother and father who were Christians, you are blessed more than words can tell. We may have had our weaknesses and we may have had our failures, but there are blessings that come from being reared by Christian parents, and children ought to realize what a blessing they have. Young people, children, thank your mother and daddy who have given their lives to Christ and seeking to walk with Him. Give thanks to them. Pray for them every day. Realize what a valuable resource God has given you, how He has blessed you as a child to have such parents. You want to know why so many in our schools, so many in our neighborhoods, why so many children are as unruly as they are? It's because they don't have parents that know God. Know, understand, realize the value of good parents. And recognize also that sometimes parents that have not learned Christ, did not learn Christ, often still taught us the lessons that have made us come to Christ and led us to be Christians. Learn from them. Realize the value of mothers and fathers. Realize that this isn't some preacher telling you that. It's not your moms and dads telling you that. That God says that if you would be wise, listen to your mothers and fathers. Receive instruction from them. And did you notice there in chapter 1, did you notice that he said that if you'll listen to the instruction of mothers and fathers, if you don't forsake that, verse 8, he says there'll be an ornament of grace about your neck and chains about of your head and chains about your neck. He said you're going to be clothed with beauty and honor. He says this wisdom that you receive by listening, he said it's the jewelry that you wear. Oh, it's not gold and silver, and it's not some crown that you put on. Not all of that. But it is what you become. I can tell you that children are made more attractive when they have parents that are wise. And children who listen to the instruction of their parents, those children are indeed clothed and draped with gold and jewels, and they are the most beautiful thing you can see. I'm going to tell you, and I mean this sincerely. Brethren, I love sitting out there in my chair. I've done that for the last 10 months now, 11. But I love sitting there in that chair because I see moms and dads coming out. And there is nothing that I see that is more beautiful than children following with their parents. There's nothing more beautiful than that. I tell you, you couldn't dress them any better. You couldn't put any finer clothes on them. You couldn't put any jewelry on them that would make them shine any brighter than what they shine when they are with their mothers and fathers and serving and seeking to know the Lord. There's nothing more beautiful than that. You can't buy and you can't clothe your children to make them as beautiful as what they are when you clothe them with Christ, when you clothe them with God, and when you clothe them with the wisdom that comes from God. Children are made more attractive. They're made beautiful when they listen and learn from the wisdom of parents. On the other hand, when children don't have that, children can put on whatever they want to, and they can dress up any way they want to, and you can adorn them any way you want to, and they're ugly. Any of y'all remember back to the times when you were thinking about having children, and any of you think about the fact that when you were getting ready to have children, you were thinking about bringing children into the world? Did any of you at that point in your life say, I sure hope I have an ugly kid? I'm going to tell you that there are those that have raised their children in the poorest of circumstances, who have raised some of the most beautiful children that can ever be adorned in any way to show their beauty. I will tell you that when you show me a young woman who's growing up at the feet of mothers and fathers who are Christians and grows up and adorns herself with that Christian spirit, there's nothing more beautiful. When you've got a young man who has learned about Christ and is seeking to serve Him and walk with Him, there is nothing more beautiful than that child. And it's not because of what you put on them. Not because of the outward adorning. But it's the beauty you see in them because of who they are. Brethren, you show me parents, you show me children that honor their parents, I'll show you children that are beautiful. In Proverbs chapter 30, in verse 1, he talks about the prophet speaking. And when you get down to verse 11, he says, There is a generation that curseth their father and doth not bless their mother. There is a generation that are pure in their own eyes and yet is not washed from their filthiness. There is a generation, oh how lofty are their eyes, and their eyelids are lifted up. There is a generation whose teeth are as swords, their jaw teeth as knives. They devour the poor from off the earth, the needy from among men. You want to talk about that generation that's raised because they're not raised to respect and to honor mothers and fathers. There's a generation that curseth their father and doth not bless their mother. And what happens to that generation? Where does that generation finally find itself? You want to see the tragic end? To children that don't listen, don't heed the instruction? You want to see where you're headed? verse 17. The eye that mocketh at his father. Proverbs 30, verse 17. The eye that mocketh at his father, and despiseth to obey his mother, the ravens of the valley shall pick it out, and the young eagles shall eat it. That's not a pleasant thought. Not a pleasant picture. But he says, here's what's coming to that one. He said, the birds of prey will eat your flesh. Because you'll never be what you could have been. Because you didn't listen to the instruction of mothers and fathers. And when you have children that do not respect mothers and fathers, when you have children that do not have the respect do not show the respect to mothers and fathers, you might also want to be reminded that in the law of Moses, in Deuteronomy 27, he said, a child that disrespects mother and father, that would smite mother and father, that does not respect them, he says that child should be stoned to death. You want to see what God thinks about those children that think they don't have to listen? That thinks they're smarter than mothers and fathers? You want to know what their end is? God said they're worthy of death. You want to know what the penalty is for a parent that won't accept his responsibility? Go over and read in Leviticus chapter 20 and verse 9, because in that place he talks about what happens. Parents have a responsibility. And if they curse mother and father, he said they'll be put to death. If they're rebellious, they won't listen, they won't heed the instruction, God said they should be put to death. Children who do not honor mothers and fathers are going to be harshly judged by God in the final day. They were in the Old Testament. And they still will be. We're fortunate today. We live under the law of Christ. We live during a time of grace and peace and long suffering and mercy. And we as parents, grandparents, we show that grace and long suffering and mercy. We do not despise God and His will in our lives. And we seek as best we can to rear our children to see God, to know Him. Jesus Christ, the Son of God, was born of Mary. Born of Mary. Do you remember what He says in Luke chapter 2, verses 51 and 52? They've gone to Jerusalem, they observe the feast, they become separated from their son, and they find Him. And in Luke 2, it says in verse 51, He went down with them and came to Nazareth and was subject unto them. But His mother kept all these sayings in her heart, and Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. You see that in verse 51 it says of the Son of God, of Jesus Christ the Son of God, it says that He was subject to His mother and father. Brethren, children deserve the blessing of godly parents. They deserve that blessing. They should receive it. Solomon says that the thing that comes immediately after a knowledge of God, an understanding of God, and a giving yourself to God, and understanding His will, is for parents to accept their responsibilities. Children ought to be thankful if they have Christian parents. If you have parents who have taught you well, you ought to be thankful. You ought to be thankful because they've done what they've done and they've given their lives in many cases to trying to help you not to make the mistakes they've made, and to see better, and to learn better, and to know better, and to do better. Because I believe that every parent here, every grandparent here, above everything in this world, wants to see your children and grandchildren go to heaven. And you're trying to work to that end. Wisdom, understanding, and knowledge come from God. But children, understand the value of your parents. And realize what a resource you have if you have Christian parents. Be thankful to God every day and night for what you have in them. If you're here tonight and you're not a Christian, you need to become one. You need to obey the gospel tonight and be washed in the blood of the Lamb. If you're one of God's children, you wandered away, you need to come home tonight. Don't put it off any longer. Come home while you have time and opportunity. If you're subject to His invitation, we beg you to come while we stand and sing.
Just